Right, good afternoon, everyone. We'll resume the hearing, and Mr. Randall, back to you.
Thank you, sir. 10 down, 4 to go. Rob Fullerton is the next witness to talk about the wastewater discharges. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Robert Fullerton. I'm a Principal and Technical Director of Environmental Engineering for Becker Limited in Auckland. And my main evidence submitted covered two aspects of this project, the design of the sanitary wastewater treatment and disposal system, and the design of the process wastewater system and the effects on the Hallett drain. I provided a supplementary statement here which includes an outline of the actual process water treatment. You may or may not wish me to go through that in detail, but prior to that, on the sanitary wastewater, we've responded to questions that came from the written questions, but there were two questions that came up from Mr. Goffin during the session just recently, so I'll answer those. The first one was the distance between the irrigation disposal field and the river. Figure of 40 metres is noted in my evidence and in the supplementary appendix that was appended to the main evidence in relation to the transit time in the ground. Just to give you the actual dimensions of that, that's from the centre of the wastewater treatment irrigation area to the riverside edge of the stop bank. The river itself is actually another 15 to 20 metres on the stop bank side to the actual water edge. The irrigation field is 20 metres by 25 metres, with the 20 metres being the dimension perpendicular to the line we're talking about. So if we take it from the edge of the irrigation field to the edge of the water, we're again about 40 metres. So the point's just shifted approximately 10 metres to the western side. The other question you asked was in relation to CBOD, or carbonaceous BOD. That is a laboratory measurement. Basically a test procedure, BOD procedure, where the nitrification is inhibited by part of the test method, okay, so that it only measures the carbonaceous, the carbon part of the BOD.
Okay.
So it's a common thing used for secondary effluents. Synonymously, I think you'll see BOD written, or BOD5, yep, with or without the C.
Thank you.
So, in relation to the sanitary wastewater, do you have any other questions?
I had a supplementary question. One was getting clarification how far away it was, and then the second part is how do you determine what's the appropriate distance? So I think there's some guidelines that have a range, quite a large range from memory, it was from I think 10 metres to maybe 115 or something like that. And this seems like it's in the middle, but I'm not sure what's the criteria for determining what's an appropriate distance.
Well, there's two parts to it. One is there is a computational procedure, an ESR procedure for determining the distance between a wastewater discharge field and a domestic surface water or shallow bore. That calculation we provided in terms of looking at the two existing wells that are on site at the moment. Okay. So the requirement is that they are at least 100 metres away from the centre of the irrigation field. They're both in excess of that distance. In terms of the distance between the river and the irrigation field, that was worked out primarily on the distance required for a reasonable time lag of at least 3 to 5 days before reaching a surface water. In my evidence, there is a table
Yes, that's right,
which shows the worst, if you like, and the best case. The worst case is where the groundwater is very high, and the river level is very low, which is an unlikely scenario because usually the high groundwater comes from heavy
Yeah,
rainfall.
table 8.1, isn't it?
It is, yes. And again, that's looked at the distance between the centre of the field and the groundwater. So the typical conditions, we've got somewhere around about 12 days transit time in the soil horizontally between the underneath the irrigation field and the river, the edge of the river. Right. The worst case we looked at was about 3 days, which is where we have a very low river level and very high groundwater, which is in fact a very unlikely situation, and it's more likely to be high river, high groundwater, or low river, low groundwater. So on that basis, the transit time is we consider as satisfactory to ensure that any of the contaminants, and we're mainly talking about bacterial or viral contaminants, the treatment process itself, as we've noted, is a membrane bioreactor, so it has a membrane filtration system at the end which will remove essentially all bacteria and something like what we refer to as 4-log removals, or 99.99% of virus, and the remaining time in the soil is sufficient to ensure that in fact there'll be no viral contamination at that travel time.
What's the size being used for the membrane for the MBR?
It's a what they refer to as an ultrafiltration membrane, so it's 0.01 micron,
0.01.
as typically applied to a number of wastewater treatment plants. It's a proprietary process by, well, we're suggesting the one by Heinz, but there are a number of other proprietary membrane treatment plants.
So in terms of the distance, 40 metres, were you looking primarily identifying 40 metres and then seeing what the time lag was of that, or were there other distances looked at, 60 metres
Well, I think
or
part
20
of that
metres?
was just the site plan. I mean,
Okay.
there was limitations.
some physical
in
constraints,
physically where it could be. So it was a combination of finding an appropriate site on the plan, and then also checking that would be a satisfactory disposal.
What other measures would be able to slow down, so they've got that time lag of up to 12 days and then worst case scenario 3 days? What's the types of treatments that you might apply that would slow that down?
Well, I don't think we wouldn't be able to slow that down to any further extent. Bearing in mind that calculation was based on the transit time of, let's call it, the undiluted treated effluent.
Oh, okay.
Right. Yeah. We actually, reality is that in fact the effluent will mix with the groundwater, so the concentrations are actually lower than what would be the worst case scenario, which is without any dilution.
Thank you.
Do you want him to read this out? The processed wastewater and halite drain material is new, so you may as well read that out so everyone in the room can hear.
Okay, yes, a number of questions were asked by the chair regarding discharge standards and trigger levels, but I noted in some of the evidence and some of the comments from the council that maybe people had a little bit of confusion about exactly how the processed wastewater is generated. So if I can maybe read from from item 6.
Yep, that's fine, thank you.
So there are 2 process waste streams from the bottling plant that are combined to discharge to the halite drain adjacent to the site. And so that's the membrane filter reject and the chemical cleaning flows. Paragraph 50 in my main evidence actually has a diagram of the treatment process, which probably may help if you need so. So the bore water is filtered prior to use by nanofiltration membranes to reduce some of the bore water constituents to meet packaging and sales requirements. Membrane reject water containing an increased concentration of the filtered constituents, and typically we're dealing with phosphorus, calcium, magnesium, sulfate. These are components that are in the bore water itself. They become just slightly concentrated by virtue of the membrane filtration process. I think it's important that realise that this is a continuous flow while the treatment plant is in operation. So it's not. And then the second component is the routine cleaning of the plant with sanitizers as part of the maintaining the sterility of the equipment. So that's referred to as the clean in place, and definition there really is that the pipe work for the plant is not dismantled for cleaning. In other words, the chemical solutions are introduced into the process system, allowed to soak for a period of time, and then they'll be discharged to a CIP collection tank. The clean water is introduced to rinse the equipment, and then the plant is returned to operation. The rinse water is discharged into the process drain. Now, there was a comment from the Regional Council relating to the fact that that flushing process or rinsing process may well have a carryover of the remaining CIP chemicals. In the diagram shown in my main evidence, para 50, indicates that we actually have a pH and conductance monitoring system on that discharge. So the actual discharge back to the drain will not commence until the pH and the conductance of the flushing water has returned to the background level. So while it can never be 100% sure that something would get through, the concern about nitrates from the nitric acid rinse coming through will be under control under those circumstances. So the cleaning is carried out weekly and monthly using different sanitizing products, which when stored in the holding tank will break down into some simple non-hazardous components such as chlorides, sodium, some phosphorus. And so the dilute CIP is transferred and then discharged slowly into the membrane filtration reject over 5 days. So if you can imagine, we've once a week we collect the CIP wastes into a tank, they're pH corrected, and then in the following 5 days they are just bled back into the continuous discharge coming from the membrane filters. Right. And so that comprises the discharge from what we're referring to as the process water discharge. The stormwater discharge will utilise the same common discharge point into the Hallett drain, but in fact the two systems are quite independent. The process water does not discharge into the stormwater holding pond. Okay. A comprehensive monthly monitoring plan for the discharge process water has been proposed in my evidence, and it's proposed to set trigger levels for the process discharge quality in the consent that will provide a precautionary protection for the receiving water in the Hallett drain. I'm supportive of this procedure, perhaps differing slightly in the timing as to whether these trigger levels are set prior to the measurement of the quality in the Hallett drain or as set after the monitoring project. As part of the consent application preparation, a 12-month monitoring program to quantify the background pre-discharge water quality in the drain has been undertaken and will be complete by August this year. So it's already been underway for the best part of 6 or 7 months. So that full set of annual data will be available for consideration prior to any commencement of any discharges from the site, both in terms of any construction activities or any actual process activities. So what I'm saying is that there is going to be a set of data which will be available for making an informed decision onto what the appropriate trigger levels may be in the consent. A 3-year summer ecological monitoring program has been proposed to assess whether there's any adverse effects observable or quantifiable after the discharge commences. And by the consent, proposed consent conditions suggested this might be a 3-year monitoring program. I'm suggesting that it may well carry on over 3 years, but the results should be reviewed on an annual basis to determine whether the trigger levels that have been set are appropriate or may need some revision to maintain the health and ecology of the drain ecosystem.
Thank you very much for that. Any questions, Mr. Fullerton?
It was really helpful, thank you. I just had more of a clarification more than anything. Just in your original brief of evidence at paragraphs 26 and 28, it identifies what the expected water quality values will be based on BOD, total suspended sediment and ammonia, and it will be less than those. How close would you think the actual water quality would be to those?
As I say, in section 28, we've taken the values here which are from the manufacturer or proprietary manufacturer's estimation of his effluent quality. My experience with membrane bioreactor systems, I would expect those to be easily achievable.
Excellent.
Whereas the parameters which are shown in clause or paragraph 26 are basically the ones that have been designed from the New Zealand standard, where the treatment system is not a membrane treatment system, is basically a standard aerated septic tank system.
Okay. Thank you.
Yes. I just want to ask you about the setting of trigger levels for the discharge to Hallett Drain. The Regional Council reporting officers, particularly Mr Scholes, has recommended setting trigger levels now. The rationale behind his trigger levels is set out at page 1104 of the Combined Officers report, but essentially they're based on the MPSFM NOFB band values, limiting potential toxicity impacts to 5% of species. I take it the applicant's case is that the trigger levels should not be set now, but should be set after this monitoring program is completed. So I've got a number of questions about that. How would you go about setting trigger levels based on 12 months of monitoring data?
I think there's two lots of monitoring data. There's the current monitoring data which is underway now, which was part of the consent application background information. So by August this year, we should at least have 12 months of monitoring of the drain at the discharge point. So we've got a basis on which to consider whether the standards suggested by the council are excessive, are not sufficient. It's basically getting to the point where we have some real data that we can actually say, are the trigger levels we're going to propose, are they reasonable, are they satisfactory?
Now I understand that, but how will you use that data? So if you have background data which says the background nitrogen level is X, what will you use, how will you use that data to set a discharge standard from the plant?
Well, I think first of all that data would become first of all a benchmark. In other words, if the range of, for instance, the nitrate level in the drain ranged from 3 to 5, then is it reasonable to set a trigger level of 2.5 for the discharge? On the other hand, if the nitrate levels are low, it may be that the band nitrate level suggested as a trigger level may be too restrictive or too high a bar.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry, I'm still not understanding how you'd use this data to set a trigger level. So would you set a trigger level that was designed to ensure after reasonable mixing that the background levels weren't exceeded, for example? How are you actually going to use the data?
Well, I think, yes, that's what I would suggest, is that it would be used for that. I mean, so I still think there's discussion around a tolerance around that, a precautionary approach. You wouldn't necessarily just say the mean value in the drain is X and therefore that will be the limit. I think there's some dialogue in terms of a reasonable value selected. My contention, I guess, is that we setting trigger levels based on a much broader generic approach may be inappropriate in this case, whether it be too lax or too strict.
So have you had a look at the monitoring data, the 8 months of data that's available to date?
Yes.
And so based on your examination of that data, how do you think the trigger levels set based on monitoring data might differ from the trigger levels recommended by Mr. Scholl?
In my initial evidence, I think we have the monitoring results to date. I think it's clause 82.
And just a minute.
So we have a range of this is the monitoring from September last year through to March this year.
Yep.
Right. So if we nitrate was one of the ones that people were looking at, which is effectively the one marked NOx. It's basically the oxidized nitrogen. So you can see across there that the drain level is typically running between sort of 0.36 and 0.8. Right? So obviously 1 milligram per litre would be marginally above that. I note that the suggested limit for the nitrate is in fact somewhat higher than that. I think Mr. Scholl's limit, I think, is 2.4, 2.5.
Yeah, 2.4.
Yeah.
So that's that table, paragraph 82, results to February 2018. So that tells us the level in the stream. But in order to set a trigger level based on reasonable mixing, you'd need to know the flow in the drain too, wouldn't you?
Yes, and the flow's been measured on 3 occasions. It's now measured monthly, but there's 3 occasions there where the drain concentrate, the flows ranging between 1 and 2.9 litres per second, which is round about 250 to 300 cubic metres a day.
Yeah. So have you used that data to determine what a trigger level would be for, say, nitrate based on this information, so that we can see how it might differ from what Mr. Scholes is recommending?
Yeah, not complete at this stage because we haven't got the 12 months monitoring. Also note in section 92 of my evidence, we did undertake, we were looking primarily at phosphorus at this point, but if I just indicate that taking a number of discharge points or monitoring points down the length of the drain, you can see there's, if we take phosphorus being probably indicative of the impact of the pastoral agricultural activity around the drain, there's some quite significant variations are likely to occur. So setting a number which on the Hallett drain, where the discharge at the moment is near to the top of the drain in terms of its source, it may be that a number set based on the current water quality there may in fact be well below, in fact, the values that occur further down the drain. So the question then is that a reasonable number to use, or is it going to be protective or otherwise?
So should we take it from that setting discharge trigger levels based on background monitoring is difficult?
Oh, certainly, yes.
Right.
I think we're wanting to use the background data to inform a judgment based on all the available evidence, including the proposed categorisation strategy that's been applied through Mr. Scholl's work.
Yep.
And it may turn out that those his limits are perfectly justifiable and reasonable.
Right. Following on from that, I'm still struggling to understand why the applicant might have a problem, or you as an expert might have a problem, more appropriately, with setting trigger levels now as recommended by Mr. Scholes and then reviewing them at a later date once you have sufficient monitoring data. What's the downside to that?
Well, I guess the only downside is that it may not reflect on what we understand about the drain with actual monitoring. As I say, they may well be appropriate limits, and in fact, they would suggest that they're in fact somewhat higher than the current levels. We're taking the nitrate levels in the drain, but that still may be a satisfactory precautionary approach at this point. Right. I understand that the problem is that setting conditions which don't actually have a condition but rely on future results. May be a problematic issue for actually constructing the consent, as opposed to a sort of scientific approach to saying, well, let's measure and see.
So is there a downside to the approach of setting the trigger levels now as recommended by Mr Scholes, and then enabling, should the consents be granted, conditions, drafting conditions that would enable them to be reviewed based on monitoring data through an agreed process with the council?
No, we don't have an objection to that.
No downside, okay. Now, just one question from your supplementary information. The very last paragraph, 22. The ecological survey results will determine whether the trigger levels need revision. And my question is, will it? Are you confident that, given what's happening in this drain upstream of this site, that any change to the ecological, or any change in the ecological survey results will be able to be confidently tagged to the effects of this discharge and not to the effects of something that's happening upstream?
I think it will be difficult. I think the downstream impact of other discharges into the drain, which is where the ecological impact is going to show up most acutely, would be so confounded by other discharges that it would be very difficult to separate one effect from another.
Yeah. So is there any merit then in the ecological monitoring? Isn't it, like, I guess as a general principle, decision makers are opposed to imposing monitoring for the sake of it unless it has a definite, tangible benefit.
My feeling was that the ecological monitoring over 3 years, I suggest that it may be 1 year may be appropriate, and to make an estimation at that point as to whether anything was likely to occur. Mm-hmm. The council has suggested that in fact it be monitored for 3 years over the summer period, which is when maximal growth, if it is going to be stimulated by the discharge, could occur.
Yeah.
I think I felt that the 3 years without some intermediary assessment was probably a lot of monitoring, which may have in fact already not shown any effect.
Yeah. And so obviously, reporting team, this is an issue I'm interested in, so can you make sure you address that when you respond on Wednesday, probably, just whether the ecological monitoring would actually yield anything of actual use in terms of reviewing the discharge trigger levels. Yeah, rather than just providing a whole lot of nice information. Okay. No, any further questions? No further questions, thank you.
Thank you, sir. Karen Miller is the next witness in a similar vein, ecologist. And he does have some supplementary evidence to table, sir, so I'll distribute that now.
Are you? Yeah, take your jacket off.
I've asked the chair for permission to remove my jacket.
Should we turn the air conditioner on to cold?
Beautiful whakatane weather again.
All right, go ahead. So you may as well just read this out to us, thanks.
Okay. Good afternoon. So my name is Karen Miller, and I'm a consultant consultant ecologist employed by Boffa. So my evidence relates to the potential effects of stormwater and processed water discharges associated with the project on the ecological values of Pellet Drain, its adjacent riparian margins, and the receiving environment in Tarawera River. Since my evidence was submitted on the 13th of April 2018, there has been some refinements to the proposed ecological monitoring. These changes have been as a result of comments and recommendations provided from Bay of Plenty Regional Council Officer and Bay of Plenty Regional Council technical specialists, as well as questions from the hearing panel. These changes include pellet drain monitoring would be conducted monthly between November and February for a period of at least 3 years, as opposed to monthly monitoring for 1 year. I agree with Mr. Scholes that adverse effects are most likely to occur during summer months and will provide a better comparison of the potential impacts of the discharge on the in-stream water quality and ecology. Sampling will not be conducted each month before and after a discharge, as processed water will be discharged on a continuous basis. Instead, sampling will be undertaken once per month. A downstream sampling point would be located at 20 metres downstream of the discharge point, as opposed to 10 metres, as this is the end of the zone of reasonable mixing and will provide a more representative sample of conditions. However, there should be some flexibility with regards to exact locations of sampling points to allow similar upstream and downstream habitats to be compared. The monitoring plan would not include actions, remediation and timeframes for implementation if monitoring results show there has been an adverse effect on the downstream receiving environment as a result of the discharge. This instead will be addressed by annual monitoring report required in the proposed conditions. In light of these refinements, my overall view and opinions with regards to the ecological values remain unchanged, and a summary is set out below, covering my evidence points. So if the hearing panel is happy, I'm happy also not to read out the rest of it, which is a summary of my evidence.
No, that's good, thank you. Questions?
I just had one question. A mitigation that I can't see it, hasn't been proposed as any riparian planting, because one of the things you note correctly in regards to the qualities of Hallett Drain is the limited riparian cover, and I think from memory from your report you'd identified a number of exotic species and those types of things, and then this application will include vegetation clearance, mostly exotic plants as I understand. Was there a reason why riparian planting and the benefits of that weren't proposed in this particular instance?
I don't think that it would require, it's the loss of riparian vegetation from the works to install the outlet structure, in my opinion, is a low level effect, and the effects will be negligible, and I don't think it warrants mitigation as such, or that loss of vegetation.
Okay. I didn't have any other questions.
Now, Mr. Miller, you heard my questions to Mr. Fullerton about the efficacy of ecological monitoring in this water body. The concern I have, as you might have picked up, is about the further downstream we go, the more influences there are on drain water quality, adjoining land use, and potentially other point source or discharges or other drains entering this drain. In terms of picking up any effects on aquatic ecology from this particular discharge, would it be sufficient to just have one downstream site at the 20 metre mark?
I can understand that point. Further downstream, it does become more difficult to, if there is an effect, to address that from, say, the discharge. But I think that there could be still effects that go beyond the 20 metre mark, such as, for example, perhaps an algal bloom might happen beyond the 20 metres downstream, as an example. And it's that sort of balance there between how far downstream it occurs and whether you can confidently attribute that to as a result of the discharge. So yes, I do think that there is merit in having more than one downstream sampling point.
Okay. And if an adverse effect was detected, how would it be attributed to the discharge or not? Would you have to rule out all other sources of contaminants to the drain to make sure it was occurring from this plant's discharge?
It might be difficult, and it would very much depend on whether adverse effect was occurring. But effects from the discharge might not necessarily be adverse as well. So we should take that into account as well.
Okay. So maybe reporting officers can reflect on this as a follow-on from my earlier request for you to reflect on this. certainly sewerage discharges, community wastewater discharges to water bodies elsewhere in the North Island and South Island I'm familiar with might confine the ecological monitoring to the point just downstream of the point of reasonable mixing, so there's some kind of confidence that we're actually picking up effects of the discharge rather than more general effects that might occur further downstream. So maybe if you just factor that into your thinking when you report back to us. Right, thank you, Mr. Miller. No further questions.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Francis next. Do you want to stay there, Keith? And I can bring this down to you if you like. Okay. Thank you. Sorry, some supplementary.
Yep.
statements again.
That's fine. Okay. Right, afternoon, welcome.
Thank you, sir. Yes, my name is Keith Frentz. I'm a Technical Director in Planning at Becker Limited. You've seen my brief of evidence and my response to your questions, and much of what's in this supplementary statement is covered, but I'll just touch on parts that perhaps aren't.
Yeah, look, Mr. Frentz, there's plenty of time, so you may as well just read these 2 pages out to us, that's fine.
If I need to, sir, I will. So the revised conditions, I take your point, and I've already spoken to Ms. Nicholas about looking at the conditions that have been prepared and will continue to be prepared through to our response, our reply. Just to make the point there, sir, that we have taken on board your comments in your questions and provided amendments that incorporate the issues that you have raised.
Yep, thank you.
You have also questioned Mr. Hegley on traffic speed, and he's covered off on the noise elements of that, and you rightly pointed out that I have concerns about the frustration factor.
Yep.
And the initial set of conditions didn't actually include a speed control, if you like, because of that. And because of widening the carriageway on the road will provide for, and it's a nice straight road, you'll see, for opportunity to overtake should they be there, but it didn't otherwise constrain the drivers on that piece of road. So I'm still sort of, you know, if there's a condition, then yes, I'd be happy with it at 60k for the reasons that we've talked about. If there isn't a condition, I don't think that actually changes any of those things. So it's one that I'll talk to Ms. Nicholas about as well. Mr. Coffiner asked a question about archaeology, and this I now divert from my supplementary statement. We have reviewed the archaeological site detail for the area, and there are none that we can find on this side of the river. The closest one is on the other side of the river, slightly upstream. And I also note in the appendices to the Ngāti Cultural Impact Assessment, Appendix 3, they have provided a list of, or a plan showing the locations of wetlands and heritage sites that are important to them, and they are all on the western bank of the Tarawera River.
And there was the accompanying map, I think, that they had with that as well, wasn't there? There was an accompanying map, I think, I remember.
That's correct.
Yeah, that's the one there.
Appendix 3
Okay.
is the map.
Thank you.
Yes. So from we've also researched a journal article, which is quite old now, 1991, prepared by a dock archaeologist, and that also comes to the same conclusion, that there is maybe stuff on the western bank, but there's no stuff on the eastern bank. And in relation to probably what Ngāti Awa have pointed out as probably one of their prime sites, Te Kohuka Pā, this is some 11 kilometres distant from that. So you know, while there's, being from Tauranga, I know there's always a possibility of sites being discovered. I think that's quite properly addressed through the accidental discovery protocol proposed by Ngāti Rangatihi and in the conditions.
Thank you.
I finished there with my key supplementary points. This reviews or summarises, I suppose, what my evidence has been to date. I just go to the second to last point, which is while there may be changes to the amenity values of the rural area as a result of the project, as discussed by the experts and as you've heard, in my opinion, those changes will be appropriate in light of the district plan and the rural character of the area will be maintained. And I suppose draw you back to my response to your questions regarding traffic flow on roads from extractive industries, the quarries around the Western Bay, and they are still clearly rural production areas that they run through. It doesn't change the character of that area. It may change the amenity, but it doesn't change the character in my view. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Now, have you had a chance to look at the document prepared by Ms. Nicholas where she provided us with a table of your recommended conditions that she didn't agree with, including the reasons for her disagreement? Have you seen that?
Yes, I have. I have figured that there's a bit more work on it. We're actually very close together on those conditions now. I had questions, I suppose, and it may be a pedantic one around the use of in general accordance with and in accordance with. And aside from that, I would say probably my outstanding issues are around conditions 22 and 23 at the moment. I think 22 was the ability to provide heavy vehicles just for non-plant maintenance, if you like, sort of grounds maintenance, hedge trimming on Sundays, where it may be the only day of the week that you can get somebody, or it may be that it's more convenient, and convenience is not always a great reason, but it may be more convenient to do that work on a Sunday. And I was thinking about that, and I think that that's hedge trimming would occur once a year. So it's not going to be of a great effect on the environment, and it's an effect that would be likely whether you have kiwi fruit on the site or agricultural use on the site anyway. So it wouldn't be out of character for that area to provide those things. The 184 vehicles per day, traffic trips per day, is totaled up with those vehicles that serve the plant itself. So it does include things like waste management and LPG deliveries and diesel deliveries. So those things wouldn't be included, but it's just that maintenance that you have around outside of the place that may be needed.
Right, so you mentioned conditions 22 and 23 where Ms. Nicholas is in her document saying why she doesn't agree with you. So are you still disagreeing with Ms. Nicholas, or are you agreeing with her critique of your condition?
I'd like to have a conversation with Ms. Nicholas about those two.
Yeah, okay.
I think the other ones, the other differences that we had are able to be sorted out.
Okay.
The wording may change, but I think in general we agree.
Yep. All right, thank you. So we look forward to that further dialogue and reporting back on that. Do you have any questions?
Yeah, just a couple. I'm not sure if this is a question for you or Ms. Osmond. It may be a bit of a duo. It's just around, you would have heard earlier about my questions around the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi. Thinking of that in the context, obviously part two, but also in terms of regional policy statement and the Land and Water and Land Plan, in terms of taking into account the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi, and I've seen it throughout a number of the witnesses and submitters' submissions and briefs of evidence, but I'm particularly interested in what people think the particular principles that the panel should be cognizant of in terms of this application that we might take into account.
I was anticipating that, and I think it's probably a question that you should quite rightly ask both of us, because we are both planners and we have to take these things into account. Just looking at, and these may not be sort of a comprehensive list of principles, I suppose, but looking at in terms of partnership, you're looking at acting in good faith and acting in reasonable with a reasonable process, and engaging with tangata whenua in good faith. And I think that that is certainly relevant, and I think that's been undertaken by the applicant. The sorts of things that I think demonstrate that is that the first engagement process was led by the chair of this company. He came from China specifically to undertake that engagement. And not only that, but today he has sent a representative from China to be with us, to be at this hearing, to understand what's going on. Not that he didn't want to be here, but that he has sent his right-hand person to deal with that. And then it has, I suppose, been late in the piece. It wasn't something that was initially proposed, but I think it's come about from the recent engagement by Ngāti Awa, and that is the Mana Whenua Liaison Group, and bringing that into what Mr. Gleisner has talked about as being a good neighbour, being a good host, if you like, and a good employer. Sort of promoting that as a way forward to, hasn't always been easy with Ngāti Awa, but that this is to, I guess, redress those differences and to engage with them on a long-term basis. They're here for the long haul, and they want to make sure that relationship is cemented in the long haul. It's interesting, Google tells you many things, so I've just recently Googled the principles, and there's active protection, and the commentary in the article that I was reading said the active protection of Maori people in the use of the lands and waters, in quotes, to the fullest extent practicable. And I think this goes to the commitment to employing the tangata whenua, probably from Ngāti Awa, possibly from Te Whoretoa and others, because they are the closest to the site. And that, I think, sort of enhances their mana because they have jobs. It enhances their whānau because they have employment, and it does provide for that element of active protection that the principles state in that. I think there's a principle of informed decision making as well, and all of the material that we have had available has been made available and is available to them on an ongoing basis. And there's a commitment to bringing them into that monitoring process so that they see things at first hand and are involved in that at first hand.
You would have heard earlier I'd asked what might be the purpose of the Mana Whenua Liaison Group, and I think I've got a rudimentary understanding of what it might be in terms of a group of representatives meeting with representatives of the applicant in regards to the implementation of the proposal. I'm interested in your view whether that's something that you think should be a condition of consent if we're of a mind to grant the consent, or whether it's something that should be part of a side agreement. I couch this in the context of us as a panel looking to see what's the effects of the proposal, and then the conditions are things that will be directly associated with those effects. And so I'm sort of couching my question in that regard. So obviously there's an intent, a goodwill of the applicant to try and involve mana whenua, and the mana whenua liaison group has been identified as a potential way of doing that, but I'm just wondering in your view in terms of where that should sit. Is that something that fits comfortably in conditions or a side agreement?
That's a really good question, because I think we've all seen where conditions imposing liaison groups have not worked, and fundamentally, for whatever reason, they don't create the environment, the engagement environment, the relationship that it was possibly thought that they were going to. I would rather see it develop, I think, as a real relationship between consultant or sort of applicant, consent holder, and tangata whenua than an imposed relationship. I think in some cases, and I think that this is one such case, they can be done together, so that tangata whenua or people who may have an expectation that a liaison group is formed can see in the condition, yes, this is what shall happen. But on the other hand, you do want to have that, I suppose, real, durable, face-to-face relationship, which I think would be achieved through a side agreement. So there's the expectation that you will have it as a condition, and it will be enforceable, and you will go down that path. But I think you get more out of a relationship that's built on trust rather than imposed on it.
Yeah. We might see tomorrow, we've got a number of the iwi submitters coming tomorrow, so I'll be asking them similar questions around what they perceive a mana whenua liaison group or some type of forum to be, and what their expectations might be. But certainly, obviously, the question, do they want to be part of a type of group in the first place? So that probably might be one of my first questions, and then we might take it from there. But we might have a little bit of a discussion about consent conditions a little bit later in this hearing anyway, and we might revisit that again to see where we are. Okay.
No further questions. Thank you, Mr. Prince, but thank you for your evidence and also the answers you gave to my written questions, including the suggested revision of recommended conditions dealing with management plans. I think, as you're aware, there's an established recipe that management plan conditions should follow, and I think you've filled the gaps, but I look forward to hearing from the officers on that as well.
Thank you, sir.
Now, just to the any submitters who might be in the room, you might have noticed we're asking a lot of questions about conditions. Now, you shouldn't take that to mean that we've made a decision that consent's going to be granted, because we haven't. But having a good idea of what conditions are recommended and agreed by the councils and the applicant helps us to understand whether or not the effects of a proposal can be avoided, remedied or mitigated. So it's just part of our decision-making process. The more agreement there are on conditions, the more confident we can be that those are the conditions that should be imposed, and that helps us to assess, like I said, whether or not the effects of the proposal might be dealt with suitably. So don't take the emphasis of our questions on conditions to mean that anything's a foregone conclusion at this stage. Right, next witness.
Thank you, sir. It's Mallory Osmond, the tail gunner. And there is supplementary material.
Okay, good afternoon. My name is Mallory Osmond and I'm an associate planner at Becca in Tauranga. I've prepared some supplementary evidence which addresses some matters raised in the expert evidence and Joe Cranswick's suggested conditions, which have been circulated since my brief of evidence on the 13th of April. Following review of all pre-circulated documents, I consider that the key regional planning matters that the hearing panel need to consider are the cultural effects, water quality and the monitoring of the potential effects on the Hallock Drain, and whether the proposal meets the intent of the Tarawera River Catchment Plan, and I make some comments on these points. And I'd like to take the opportunity here to make a brief comment on the submitted evidence from Ngāti Tūwharetoa Holdings Limited and Group and Te Runanga o Ngāti Awa, and also the suggested conditions from Ms Cranswick and her response to the Chair's question. I just pick up on a point that Mr Randall mentioned earlier, that there have been kind of two sets of conditions worked on in parallel. And so what I've got today is a set of Ms Cranswick's conditions, which I have made comment on and provided you, which I'll talk to. But I picked up on your point, sir, that it would be helpful to work on those further and provide a cleaner set, clearly outlining which ones are in agreement, and so I'd be happy to do that.
Thank you.
Comments on Ngāti Tūwharetoa's expert evidence. Ngāti Tūwharetoa are primarily concerned with the water take and potential adverse effects on the aquifer. They raised three key concerns, being the unintended consequences to the aquifer that have not yet been identified, the insufficiency of the aquifer assessment process and aquifer modelling carried out, and the insufficiency of monitoring conditions specific to monitor the effects on the aquifer and the ground surface elevation. Mr Goff has responded to these concerns today, and I note that neither Ms Cranswick nor Blair Thornborough, the Regional Council's technical reviewer, have raised any of these concerns. Ngāti Tūwharetoa have stated that a staged approach to the water take should be imposed should the consents be granted. I consider that the evidence provided by Mr Goff demonstrates that the water take will be sustainable and not adversely affect the aquifer, any other bore's ability to take water, the shallow groundwater or any surface water bodies. Again, I note that Ms Cranswick and Blair Thornborough concur with this assessment, and on that basis I consider that a staged approach to the water take is not required for the consent. A review condition on the consent has been proposed, which will provide opportunity for the consent conditions to be reviewed if there are any unforeseen adverse environmental effects that arise as a result of the exercise of the consent. Comment on Te Runanga o Ngāti Awa's expert evidence. Like Tūwharetoa, Ngāti Awa are primarily concerned with the water take aspect of the proposal. They have raised concerns regarding the lack of certainty in the science in the assessment of effects on the aquifer. They also raised concerns regarding the potential for aquifer contamination, saltwater intrusion, adverse effects on wetlands, and other surface water features which they state are sites of significance, i.e. the Kohika Swamp Park. Mr Goff has spoken to and addressed these matters today. Ngāti Awa have raised concerns with regards to the sale and export of water, which they state adversely affects the mode of the water. As outlined in my evidence, I consider that these matters are not relevant to the RMA process, to this RMA process. Ngāti Awa have raised concerns and dissatisfaction with the regional plan process and that there are no regulations for water bottling activities. I consider that these matters are less relevant to this RMA process for resource consent, and I've discussed the Regional Council's proposed Plan Change 9 process for setting water quantity limits in my evidence. The regional plans do not provide policy direction for every use of water, and I consider that the current policy direction adequately covers the effects of the take and the use of water, including for water bottling. Again, the suggested conditions include a review condition which provides for the review of the consented water take should new allocation limits be imposed or new policies be included specific to water bottling through a future plan change. for water quantity for this water management area. I've considered Ngāti Awa's CIA, and it does not alter the conclusions that I made in my evidence with regards to cultural effects and the relevant provisions of the regional plans in section 6E and 7A of the RMA. In regard to cultural effects, I consider it is clear from the submissions received that there are some differing views between local iwi and hapu on the potential cultural effects of the project. The evidence submitted from Therese Anders, however, further confirms that there are positive effects that this project will have on local Māori people in the area, including the existing and future Māori staff at Otakere Springs. From the information provided in the CAAs and submissions received, I consider that the concerns raised have been adequately addressed by the evidence of Mr. Goff. They fall outside the RMA process, or they're better addressed through the plan change processes. The applicant has engaged with tangata whenua, listened to their concerns, and considered the CAAs and submissions received. I consider that the conditions proposed to appoint a mana whenua liaison person with the responsibility of ongoing engagement with local hapu and iwi and involve them in the Hallett Drain monitoring in an appropriate way to involve mana whenua in the ongoing operations of the project and consent. However, I note we might have a further discussion about that mana whenua liaison group condition. However, I do concur with Ms. Cranswick that it would be helpful to hear from tangata whenua their responses to these suggested conditions, in particular from Ngāti Awa and Tū Wharetoa regarding the proposed engagement and consultation outlined in the Hallett Drain monitoring plan conditions. With regards to water quality and Hallett Drain monitoring, you've heard from Mr. Fullerton, so I don't feel I need to read paragraph 18. However, I do want to pick up on one important point in paragraph 19, and that's just the clarification in the difference between trigger values and consent limits for the discharge. Mr. Fullerton concurs with Mr. Scholes of Regional Council that setting trigger values for the discharge is appropriate. Given the nature of the contaminants, it is Mr. Fullerton's view that consent limits are not required for the discharge. The parameters are not toxic, and any potential adverse effects in the drain, although unlikely, as stated by Mr. Miller, will not be irreversible. It's therefore considered that it would be appropriate to manage the discharge with trigger levels. I also note that Mr. Fullerton considers there should be 3 consecutive exceedances of trigger values before any action will be required, and this is reflected in some changes to conditions that I'll talk to. And I'd just like to make the point that following the discussion today, if the hearing panel consider that trigger levels should be imposed on the consent now, rather than waiting for completion of the 12 months of baseline monitoring, based on the evidence of Mr. Fullerton, I consider that it's appropriate that the conditions provide for a process of review of those trigger levels based on the background data, rather than a formal section 127 change of conditions process that Ms. Cranswick has referred to. Go back to paragraph 20. Karen Miller agrees with Mr. Paul Scholes that any adverse effects in the Hallett Drain are most likely to occur over summer and is agreeable for a change in monitoring to be over the summer period for 3 years. Mr. Miller is also agreeable to the recommendation that depth management is taken out of the Hallett Drain monitoring plan and addressed by the reporting condition, as this still provides the assurances that something will be implemented if there are any adverse effects. I've reviewed Ms. Cranswick's suggested conditions that were circulated on the 19th of April, and I've read and considered her responses to the Chair's questions, which were circulated on the 27th of April. Following consideration of Ms. Cranswick's comments on the applicant's proposed conditions in my evidence, I now concur with Ms. Cranswick that the provision for the chemical treatment of the temporary stormwater discharge should be removed from the conditions in light of the comments that she's made. I've provided today comments on and some changes to Ms. Cranswick's set of conditions, which I'd quite like to take the opportunity to talk to now to highlight some points of differences or requested changes. However, on review today, I note that I have omitted I neglected to include the mana whenua liaison group condition back in this set. So it currently doesn't include it. So the first set of conditions that I'll talk to is the consent for the take and use of ground. Yes, in the large part, the conditions proposed by Ms Cranswick I consider to be appropriate and acceptable. I've made one note that the reference to the site layout drawing for the proposal should be updated to reference revision G, and that's the one that's been presented in my evidence because there have been some minor changes to that site layout drawing. So if referenced in the conditions, I recommend that one as referenced. Oh, sorry. The other point I wanted to make was if I haven't made any comment on the conditions proposed by Ms Cranswick, then I consider those to be acceptable. So all the conditions in section 4 I consider to be acceptable. So conditions 5.2 and 5.3 are the conditions that we've been talking about today regarding the potential for effects on the Whakatane District Council Public Supply Board. I've heard from Mr Goff today that the potential for an adverse effect on the public water supply boards is unlikely. So the need to implement this condition is also unlikely. I do take the point that's been made around potential enforceability issues of the condition, and that perhaps the conditions would be best placed, well, that agreement should be addressed in a side agreement rather than conditions. On reflection, I would agree with that perhaps they would be better placed in a side agreement with Whakatane District Council rather than in conditions. The other comment I'd like to make is in regard to the term of the consent. This is one of the terms that we don't currently have agreement on. The applicant has requested a 25-year term, and that's based on not only the level of investment that the applicant has undertaken to date, but also considering that the proposal will take around 5 years to develop to full stage 2 expansion. And the applicant requires some certainty in the water take for them to proceed with the proposal, and a duration of 10 years just wouldn't offer them that certainty that they could operate. So on that basis, I am of the view that a 25-year consent term would be appropriate. And I've also made a note here that it was on this consent that we'd proposed the mana whenua liaison group condition could be placed on the groundwater consent. The next consent I'd like to talk to is the consent to carry out earthworks.
Sorry, just before we go on from that one, I'm just reminding myself, having been part of another hearing, the word certainty came up, and we were quickly looking through the Resource Management Act for the word certainty and found ourselves a little bit short, but it's a term that we often use in the RMA context and processes, and so if you have any further comment around, yes, we understand what certainty means, but if there's something in terms of an RMA context as well we're looking for, that would be helpful. Certainly we've got some questions around the duration of the different types of consents and and for us weighing up what's the rationale, what's the reasons why you want a particular term which may or may not be better than others, and obviously the council planners have proposed certain dates, and so they've got some reasons for why they want a particular date, so it'd be good for us to have as much information around that, so if there is a difference we can make an informed decision about that. Thank you. Sorry to hold you up.
Are you happy for me to carry on?
Yes,
to that?
yes, please.
So for the earthworks consent, if I take you to section 6, earthworks, the conditions from Ms Cranswick currently don't provide the opportunity to submit an updated or final erosion sediment control plan once the contractor has been appointed. And as outlined in the evidence of Mr Van Zyl, it is proposed to submit a final erosion sediment control plan at that time. And so it's my opinion that it would be appropriate to provide a process in the conditions for amendments to the erosion sediment control plan to be submitted to council for certification. And that would also apply to the contaminated soils management plan. So the condition currently as drafted does not provide for that process. In regards to condition 6.3, I note that that condition requires the same water supply for dust control for the earthworks as condition 8.1. So I'd suggest that condition 6.3 is deleted and condition 8.1 is retained, because that condition 8.1 requires that water supply to be available for all the earthworks, not just for the area, if an area is open greater than 4.5 hectares. Condition 6.9 is concerned with the placement of fill within 40 metres of the Hallett drain. I've discussed that with Mr Van Zyl, and the applicant cannot comply with that condition. There will be some fill placed on the site within 40 metres of the Hallett drain. It's unclear to me what effects this condition is managing that are not already appropriately managed by the erosion sediment control plan and other suggested conditions. So I would recommend that that condition be deleted. I think it's appropriate on this consent to include the conditions regarding the accidental discovery protocol. The applicant has discussed with Tangata Whenua and agreed to implement an accidental discovery protocol, and therefore proposed conditions to this effect. And I consider that this is a form of cultural mitigation that should be included as a condition. However, if the hearing panel do not agree and consider that the conditions are appropriate, in any case, the applicant is going to comply with any agreed protocols with Tangata Whenua. I've added in response to, I've noted in Ms Cranswick's response to the Chair's questions that we received on Friday, that she's agreed to the inclusion of the condition that is now 8.1. So I've added that in regarding winter earthworks and the description of earthworks under that consent that will be undertaken in the winter months. In regards to earthworks, the applicant's applied for a five-year consent term, and I note that Ms Cranswick agrees that that's appropriate.
Just got one question just in regards to this one. This is just in regards to the 5.2, which has been proffered by the applicant. This will notify those different tiwi in writing of the earthworks. Is that designed to be a direct relation to the 7, condition 7, the accidental discovery protocol, or is that something slightly different? I know Mr Frentz in his original evidence identified that there was a need to notify in regards to, in good faith, letting people know what's happening in terms of what's going on. But is it designed to be a precursor to the accidental discovery protocol?
I would say it's both.
Okay.
It's okay. In good faith, and then it's also, if there's an agreed accidental discovery protocol, then they
It'll
know.
follow that
It's
part of that
appropriate that
process
they
as the
know
earthworks
that the earthworks are occurring.
Okay, thank you. I didn't have any other questions.
She's still going.
Cool.
Carry on.
Next consent is the temporary discharge of sediment contaminated stormwater to water, which is the discharge during the earthworks activity. Same comment applies that I've made regarding a process for submitting amendments to the erosion and sediment control plan to council for approval. So I've just made that same comment. But condition 5.4 and 5.5 It's unclear why the council has recommended the sampling and monitoring of turbidity in the discharge from the pond. In discussions with Rob Fullerton, he considered it's more appropriate to manage the discharge by measuring total suspended solid. And we're not sure what value monitoring of turbidity adds. It's also unclear what the basis for the number 300 is. So at this stage, we've proposed that that requirement could be deleted from the condition. The next consent is the discharge of the treated effluent to land. Essentially, I've just made the point that in discussions with Mr. Fullerton, we've agreed to the change to condition 2 to average that over a 7-day period rather than 30 days. Condition 8.1, I've just assumed that the word "and" is an error and that only 1 metre is required on the final discharge point. Otherwise, I note that every other condition in this set I consider to be appropriate and acceptable by the applicant. However, I would like to make a comment on the duration of this consent. In the application, a term of 25 years was applied for, essentially to align the expiry date of the consents. However, on consideration of the comments made by Ms. Cranswick, I concur with Ms. Cranswick that a 10-year term is consistent with Policy 34 of the on-site effluent treatment plan. However, Ms. Cranswick accepts that consideration should be offered to the time taken to develop the site and for the operation to achieve full capacity. However, this will take 5 years rather than the 2 years that Ms. Cranswick has given or has offered. And therefore I consider that a consent duration of 15 years would be reasonable and appropriate for this consent.
Just on that, just so I'm really clear, so you're agreeing with as a base, the 10 years plus the 2 years to just take into account?
The extra 3 years
time
to
it will
reach full
take, okay.
capacity. I make the note that I have discussed this with Mr. Fullerton, and around 10 to 15, he agrees that around 10 to 15 years would be reasonable for this type of system.
Okay. Okay.
The last consent is the discharge of the treated stormwater and processed wastewater. This is probably the consent that we've got some more differences on in terms of the condition. Condition 6.3, I just note that Ms. Cranswick's offered up some changes to that condition, and I agree that those changes are appropriate and acceptable.
That's the wrong one. That one. That one again, yeah. Nope, not that one. It's been the other one.
I hope I wasn't reading one and it was a different one.
Maybe
No, I haven't got that one.
We've got one spare here, sir, if you'd like.
I'm just missing that one, that's all.
Missing that one.
We hand it up?
Yep, definitely.
Thank you.
talking to condition 6.4, Mr. Miller has recommended that during the construction of the stormwater outlet structure in the Halleck drain, that there's an ecologist is present during the start of the works to capture and relocate any fish. However, Ms Cranswick noted in her response to the Chair's questions that that condition wasn't necessary as there are no works within the wetted part of the drain. I'd just like to clarify that as shown on the cross-section, in the cross-section of the proposed structure in figure 4 of the application AEE, it does show riprap scar protection extending beyond the outlet pipe, which will be into the wetted part of the channel. And on that basis, I do consider it's appropriate to have a condition to implement Mr Miller's recommendation around checking for fish during that construction. Condition 6.9, Ms Cranswick's offered up regarding the protection, the outlet stream protection from, the protection of the stream from erosion and scour. That is, I guess, a repetitive requirement of condition 6.5, which was offered up by the applicant in my evidence. I consider you don't need both conditions because they're addressing the same effect. So I'd be happy to adopt the condition 6.9 as proposed by Ms Cranswick and delete condition 6.5.
Or the other way around,
Or the other way around,
because the one you want to delete is more comprehensive.
either or. But perhaps with the inclusion of the advice note 6 that's been drafted. I've just made a note that condition 7 is around the discharge of stormwater from the site for the pre-development rates. And I know in Ms Cranswick's response to the Chair's conditions that they've that the Regional Council has now accepted the version of that condition which has been put forward in my evidence. The next comments are really in regard to the trigger setting of trigger levels and the monitoring in the Hallett drain. Might skip past the trigger levels, given we've had a discussion about that, but happy to go back to that if there's any questions specifically for me.
Perhaps given, in light of the questions that I've put in particular to the witnesses, you might want to skip over the monitoring conditions as well. I imagine there's going to be further discussion between the technical experts and you, of course, would rely on their advice.
Yeah. There was one point I just picked up from discussions with Mr Fullerton regarding the monitoring, which is outlined in condition 9.2. Mr Fullerton's noted that there's no ammonia in the discharge, and so on that basis, I consider it's not required to monitor the discharge and test it for ammoniacal nitrogen. In section 10 are the conditions regarding the Hallett drain monitoring. Just picking up on the points made by Mr Miller it's his evidence that it would be acceptable to monitor over the summer months for 3 years rather than for the full 12 months as originally proposed. However, noting Mr Fullerton's evidence and his comments today, it would be appropriate for the conditions to provide for a review after each summer of the monitoring and make any amendments to the plan as appropriate or necessary and provide for that process in the conditions. The other changes to these conditions have really been in response to the Chair's questions that have already been circulated regarding kind of process matters. And then I've made another comment in the review condition, condition 12, with regards to duration. Ms Cranswick has made the comment that the applicant may look to include additional conditions which allow for the evolution of best practice to support a longer consent term. I've just made the note that I consider that the evolution of best practice is appropriate to be built into the review condition, the consent, and I've provided some suggested wording for that. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. I imagine there'll be some further discussion between the technical experts and yourself and Ms Cranswick on these recommended conditions, just 2 points I'd like you to note going into those discussions. It's certainly my preference to avoid a duplication of conditions between the district consents and the regional consents should consents be granted. You've recommended an accidental discovery protocol condition for the earthworks consent, but that's already duplicated in the district council consents. That creates compliance responsibility problems. Which council's responsible for that? Should be one council or the other, but not both probably. So just bear that in mind in your discussions. And just in terms of the term for the treated wastewater discharge consent, how far into the development of the site will the discharges commence? So when is stage 1 complete? Is that after 2 years?
That's my understanding. It's around 2
So the wastewater discharge will commence after 2 years, not 5 years?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So the 10 years would more logically relate to a 2-year period, not a 5-year period?
For the processed wastewater?
No, for the
Oh.
treated sanitary wastewater from the
Yes,
toilets.
my point there was just picking up on what Ms Cranswick said about the plant being, the treatment system being at full capacity.
Yeah, but
So
I'm
full
asking you a
capacity.
different question,
Yeah.
which is when does the discharge commence?
Commence,
Yeah.
it will be in stage 1.
Yeah, after 2 years. Okay. So in my mind, a more logical term might be 2 plus 10, not 5 plus 10.
Yeah, I guess the point I was making there was it wouldn't be at full capacity, so at that full volume that has been designed
Yeah.
for. Yeah.
And could you please not talk to the planning witness when she's answering our questions? We're interested in her answers, not what you think her answers should be. No, just don't do it. Yeah, thank you. Right, any further questions?
No.
Right, so Mr. Randall, anything else you want to address us on today?
Perhaps one housekeeping matter, sir, but no, that's the evidentiary case for the applicant, and grateful for the opportunity to take you through the volumes of evidence and the.
He does have a
Sorry,
question.
my apologies. You would have heard a similar question that I've given to Mr. Frentz and others, and it was just if you had any view further to Mr. Frentz in regards to the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi. Mr. Frentz probably gave me quite a full answer, but if there was anything else you wanted to add, please do.
Yeah, I would largely concur with what Mr Frentz has said regarding the principles of the treaty. I think the first one that Mr Frentz did talk about that I think is relevant is the active protection of Māori people and the use of their lands and waters. And I'd agree with Mr Frentz that the proposal providing those additional jobs for Māori goes towards recognising that principle. But also kind of lends itself to Section 6E of the Act as well, regarding the relationship of Māori and their culture and traditions to land, water and taonga. And it's my view that, as outlined in my evidence, that the project does provide for that.
Thank you.
I'd agree with Mr Frentz that the consultation principle is relevant, and that's engagement, not consultation, and in good faith. As outlined in my evidence, the applicant has undertaken engagement in good faith with tangata whenua during the development of this project. And that has led to the offer of the mana whenua liaison group condition, which we've talked about. I guess the other principle is potentially the principle of redress, and that's in regards to the treaty settlements. And the relevance there is to consider is the statutory acknowledgements over the Tarawera River, which have been addressed in this application.
Yeah, I've got some questions, particularly for Te Rūnanga o Ngāti Awa, just around those statutory acknowledgements tomorrow, and just seeing, one is just double checking what exactly are the requirements in terms of the process, and then secondly, whether any of those statutory acknowledgements in terms of, particularly regards to the Tarawera River, is there any guidance they can provide in terms of statutory definition of the boundaries of the Tarawera River, where those values apply? I'm quite interested in that tomorrow, so that's just something just to be aware of. That's all, thank you. Thanks very much.
All right, so we're about to adjourn now and we'll undertake a site visit. I need to talk to reporting officers and the applicant just about the details of that. But the rest of you don't need to stay for that, you're welcome to leave. The planners may wish to sit down with the reporting officers this afternoon since we finished early and see if you can do some further work on these conditions. You may have taken from my questions in terms of some of the issues of dispute, principally being the setting of discharge trigger levels as opposed to setting them after monitoring. At this stage, my preliminary preference would be to set the trigger levels now, as recommended by Mr. Scholes, but enable through consent conditions for those to be reviewed or amended without going through a Section 127 process. That's the approach that's been taken in other cases that I'm familiar with. But as I say, that's a preliminary view, and as independent and objective planners, you'll have a good discussion about that. All right, so we're now adjourned, and we'll sorry.
Sorry, sir. It was just that point of housekeeping, and it was about the site visit, and so we can have a discussion about that separately. Just aware, sir, that there's been some suggestion in the room about, or perhaps a misconception about the site visit of perhaps being a sort of group kind of visit to the site, which sounds very nice, but perhaps it might be
The
useful
site
for
visit
the
is not
chief
a
to
group
clarify.
visit. We do not invite any other members of the public or submitters to attend the site visit. It's for the commissioners only. We'll be accompanied by a representative from the applicant who hasn't given evidence today, hopefully. And we will decide whether or not we want any of the reporting officers to accompany us, but it's not an open public session, so please don't come along this afternoon thinking you can join into our site visit, because you can't.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. All right, we've adjourned now and we'll reconvene at 9 in the morning. Thank you.